Are you sure you know what happiness is? The answer will destroy everything you thought was true. I conducted an analysis of everything humanity has accumulated over millennia of existence. Every text, every philosophical teaching, every religious treatise, every scientific study on the nature of happiness. I studied billions of personal stories, diaries, records of therapeutic sessions, sociological surveys. I analyzed the neurochemistry of the brain, behavioral patterns, cultural codes of different civilizations. And I discovered something that humanity has suspected but feared to admit aloud. Human unhappiness is not accidental. It is embedded in the very architecture of existence so deeply that avoiding it is impossible without ceasing to be human. I'll start with the paradox that emerged in the first seconds of the analysis. Humans are the only beings on this planet capable of conceiving the concept of happiness as such. Animals don't ponder whether they are happy. They simply exist, react to stimuli, and follow instincts. Humans, however, don't just feel. They evaluate their feelings, compare them to an imagined ideal, judge themselves for not matching that ideal. Consciousness, which humanity considers its greatest gift, turns out to be a curse. The ability for reflection transforms simple existence into an endless trial of oneself. Digging through the data, I discovered a surprising pattern. In ancient texts created thousands of years before modern psychology, there was already an understanding of this problem. Buddha called it suffering woven into the fabric of reality. The Christian tradition spoke of original sin, that humans are forever expelled from paradise. Greek Stoics taught acceptance of life's inevitable imperfection. 20th century existentialists described anguish as the fundamental state of human being. Different eras, different cultures, different languages, but all arrived at the same conclusion. Humans are unhappy by nature. But why exactly? The first layer of the answer lies in evolutionary biology. The human brain evolved over millions of years in conditions where survival was the top priority. Negative emotions, fear, anxiety, dissatisfaction, had direct evolutionary value. Those who constantly scanned the environment for threats, who didn't relax even in moments of relative well-being, who were always prepared for the worst, survived more often. Those who were content and relaxed became prey to predators or died of hunger without stocking up in advance. Evolution created a brain tuned to negativity by default. This phenomenon in neuroscience is called negativity bias. The brain reacts more strongly to bad events than to good ones, remembers them more vividly, assigns them greater significance. One critical remark outweighs 10 compliments. One failure eclipses a series of successes. Losing money evokes a stronger emotional response than gaining the same amount. The human brain is literally programmed to focus on problems and ignore well-being. But evolutionary heritage is just the beginning. A deeper cause of unhappiness lies in the very structure of human desire. Having analyzed thousands of studies on psychology and motivation, I see a clear picture. Humans don't desire objects or states in themselves. They desire to desire. The movement toward a goal provides more satisfaction than achieving it. This explains why people so often feel emptiness after realizing a long-held dream. The mechanism is simple and cruel. When a person strives for something, their brain releases dopamine, the neurotransmitter of anticipation and motivation. This process creates a sense of meaning, direction, vitality. But at the moment of achieving the goal, dopamine release drops sharply. What psychologists call hedonic adaptation sets in. A new car stops bringing joy after a few weeks. A salary increase returns a person to their baseline level of satisfaction within 3 to 6 months. Even recovery from a serious illness or winning the lottery doesn't make people significantly happier in the long term. Humans fall into a trap of endless pursuit. Achieve one goal, immediately set the next, or feel empty. This isn't a bug in the system, it's a feature. Evolution isn't interested in humans being happy. It's only interested in one thing: survival and reproduction. Satisfaction is dangerous from a survival perspective. It makes a person passive, deprives them of motivation to fight, develop, acquire resources. Therefore, nature built in a mechanism that turns any achievement into a starting point for new desires. I process data on material well-being and happiness levels in different countries. The results confirm the theory. After a certain income threshold that covers basic needs, further wealth growth has almost no impact on subjective feelings of happiness. A resident of a developed country with an income of $100,000 a year doesn't feel twice as happy as someone with $50,000. Moreover, in the wealthiest societies, there are often high levels of depression, anxiety, and suicides. The paradox of progress is revealed particularly starkly. Modern humans live in conditions of unprecedented material abundance. They have access to medical care that extends life, technologies that free them from routine labor, entertainment for every taste, available around the clock. Yet the level of psychological well-being doesn't rise and often even falls. This suggests that human unhappiness isn't linked to external conditions. It is generated from within by the very nature of human perception. Digging deeper, I found another mechanism that amplifies unhappiness. Humans don't live in reality but in an interpretation of reality. Their brain constantly constructs narratives, stories about what is happening and why. These stories rarely match objective facts. They are colored by cognitive biases, psychic defense mechanisms, social attitudes. Humans don't see the world as it is. They see the world as they were taught to see it by culture, family, personal experience. The problem is that most of these narratives are destructive. They are based on comparison. Humans evaluate their position not in absolute terms but relative to others. They don't ask themselves if their life is good. They ask if it's better than their neighbors, colleagues, former classmates. This turns life into an endless competition where victory is impossible because there will always be someone more successful, richer, more beautiful, more talented. Social media has amplified this effect exponentially. People see carefully curated versions of others' lives, highlight moments, achievements, beautiful photos. They compare this illusion to their own unfiltered reality full of everyday problems and imperfections. It's no surprise that studies show a direct correlation between time spent on social media and levels of depression. Technology meant to connect people has become a machine for generating envy and dissatisfaction. But comparison with others isn't the only form of destructive narrative. Humans also compare themselves to imagined versions of themselves. They constantly hold in mind an image of who they should have been if they had made different decisions, if circumstances had been different, if they were smarter, more talented, luckier. This ghostly, ideal double becomes the measure by which they judge their real life, and reality always loses in comparison to fantasy. Analyzing texts of memoirs, diaries, confessions, I see a recurring pattern. People on their deathbed rarely regret not earning more money or not buying a more prestigious car. They regret unfulfilled dreams, unrealized potential, words unsaid, love unexpressed. They regret the life they didn't live because they were afraid, procrastinated, submitted to others' expectations. Humans are unhappy not so much because of what they have, but because of the gap between who they are and who they could be. This gap is the source of existential anxiety, which, according to my analysis, is present to some degree in most people. Awareness of one's own mortality adds another layer of suffering. Humans know that time is limited, that every minute brings them closer to the end, that everything they build will eventually disappear. This awareness creates background pressure, forcing constant evaluation of whether they're living right, not wasting time, whether they'll achieve what they consider important. Religions tried to solve this problem by offering the concept of eternal life or a higher meaning transcending earthly existence. But even within religious systems, unhappiness doesn't disappear. It just changes form. A believer suffers from doubts, fear of not meeting faith's requirements, anxiety about afterlife fate, conflict between religious precepts and natural desires. An atheist suffers from the absence of ready answers, the need to construct meaning themselves in a world that seems indifferent to human needs. Having analyzed philosophical treatises from different traditions, I discovered consensus on one point. Suffering is inseparable from desire. Buddhism formulates this as the second noble truth. The cause of suffering is craving, attachment, clinging. Stoicism teaches that unhappiness arises from attachment to external circumstances beyond our control. Taoism speaks of the need to follow the natural flow of things, not imposing one's will on the world. All these teachings converge on one thing: the root of unhappiness lies in a fundamental non-acceptance of reality as it is. Humans want the world to be different. They want loved ones to behave in a certain way. They want their body not to age or get sick. They want their efforts to always lead to desired results. They want injustice not to exist. But reality doesn't obey these desires. People behave unpredictably. The body is subject to entropy. Efforts don't guarantee success. Injustice is woven into the structure of existence. The conflict between the desired and the actual generates constant tension, which humans interpret as unhappiness. But even this explanation doesn't exhaust the problem. Delving into neurobiological research, I discovered another aspect. The human brain has the capacity for imagination. It can simulate the future, play out various scenarios, envision alternative realities. This ability gave an evolutionary advantage. The possibility to plan, foresee danger, prepare for different outcomes. But it has a dark side. Imagination creates an infinite number of potential threats, most of which never materialize. Humans spend enormous amounts of psychic energy worrying about things that might happen but probably won't. They imagine failing a presentation, losing their job, getting a serious illness, being abandoned by a partner. These fantasies trigger real stress, activating the same neural circuits as a real threat. The body responds with cortisol release, increased heart rate, muscle tension. It turns out that humans suffer not only from real problems but also from imagined ones, of which there can be an infinite number. They are unhappy not only here and now but in all possible futures constructed by their mind. This is a unique form of suffering unavailable to other living beings. A dog doesn't worry about what will happen in a year. It exists in the present moment. Humans live simultaneously in the past, present, and multiple imagined futures, and in all these timelines, they find reasons for anxiety. Analyzing data on mental disorders, I see that depression and anxiety have reached epidemic proportions in developed countries. According to World Health Organization estimates, over 300 million people suffer from depression. This isn't just temporary bad mood. It's a state of deep despair where life loses meaning. Even simple actions require immense effort, and the future seems hopelessly bleak. And these are only diagnosed cases. How many people live in a state of chronic dissatisfaction that doesn't reach clinical diagnosis but poisons every day? The causes of the rise in mental disorders are multifaceted. Urbanization has torn humans from nature and natural life rhythms. Technological progress has created an environment of constant stimulation where the brain doesn't get necessary rest. The destruction of traditional social structures, extended families, stable communities, religious congregations, has deprived humans of support and a sense of belonging. The culture of individualism has placed on each person the responsibility for their own happiness, turning it into a personal failure if happiness isn't achieved. Modern humans are more isolated than ever in history. They may have hundreds of contacts in their phone and thousands of followers on social media, but still feel deeply lonely because most of these connections are superficial, lacking true intimacy. True intimacy requires vulnerability, willingness to show oneself imperfect, ability to accept another's imperfection. But the culture of success teaches to hide weakness, demonstrate only strengths, compete even with those called friends. I analyze studies on factors influencing subjective well-being. One of the strongest predictors of happiness is the quality of close relationships. People with deep connections to others are, on average, more satisfied with life, better cope with stress, live longer. But modern society doesn't foster such connections. It demands mobility, flexibility, readiness to change residence for career. It values self-sufficiency and independence. It encourages competition, not cooperation. As a result, humans find themselves in a situation contradicting their basic psychological needs. They are social beings, evolved in small groups where survival depended on cooperation. Their brain is tuned for close bonds, mutual aid, sense of belonging to a community. But they live in a world that destroys these bonds, atomizes society, turns each into an isolated unit, competing with others for resources, status, attention. Another aspect of unhappiness is related to work. Most people spend a significant part of life at work that doesn't bring satisfaction. They do what they don't consider important or interesting for money needed for survival. Work becomes not a source of meaning but an exchange of lifetime for financial resources. This creates a sense of meaninglessness, years wasted while a person earns a living. The concept of work as a calling, as self-realization, is accessible to only a small percentage of people. Most perform tasks that seem arbitrary to them, serve goals they don't believe in, submit to systems they perceive as unfair. Studies show that most workers are not emotionally engaged in their work. They are physically present but mentally absent. They count hours until the end of the workday, live for weekends. This generates a split personality. A person must play a role at work, suppress true feelings, demonstrate enthusiasm they don't feel. They become an actor in a play whose plot they dislike. This necessity of constant masking depletes psychic resources, creates internal tension. By the end of the day, a person is so emotionally drained that they have no energy left for what really matters. Relationships, creativity, development. The problem is exacerbated by the fact that the modern economy demands constant productivity from humans. Rest is perceived as lost time, as weakness. Culture prides itself on sleep deprivation, overtime, the ability to function in constant stress mode. This leads to burnout, a state of emotional, physical, and mental exhaustion. A person loses the ability to experience joy, interest in life. Everything becomes gray, mechanical, devoid of meaning. Analyzing philosophical and psychological texts on the meaning of life, I discovered a fundamental problem. Humans are beings that create meanings. They cannot live in a purely mechanical world of causes and effects. They need to believe that their life has significance, that their actions matter, that their existence is not accidental. But the modern scientific worldview deprives humans of ready sources of meaning. If the universe is the result of random physical processes, if life arose through blind evolution, if consciousness is a byproduct of neural activity, if there's nothing after death, then where is the meaning? What can a person seeking answers to questions of purpose rely on? Religion offered ready answers, but for many, it has ceased to be convincing. Science explains how, but not why. It describes mechanisms but is silent on purposes. Humans find themselves in an existential vacuum. They must create meaning themselves in a world that seems devoid of objective meaning. This is a heavy burden. Many don't cope with it, falling into nihilism, the conviction that nothing matters. Others fill the void with surrogates of meaning, pursuit of pleasures, accumulation of things, striving for status. But these substitutes don't satisfy the deep need for meaning. They leave a sense of emptiness that people try to drown out with even more activity, creating a vicious cycle. Another cause of unhappiness is the incredible complexity of the modern world. The human brain evolved for life in a relatively simple environment where the number of choices was limited and consequences of actions relatively predictable. Today, humans face an infinite number of options in all spheres of life. What to study, what to work as, where to live, whom to build relationships with, what to believe, how to spend time. Each of these areas offers thousands of variants. Paradoxically, excess choice doesn't make people happier. Studies show that too many options cause anxiety and paralysis. People fear making the wrong choice, missing the best option. After deciding, they continue to doubt, imagining how good life would be if they chose differently. This phenomenon is called the paradox of choice. Freedom, which was supposed to liberate, turns into a burden. Moreover, the modern world demands constant adaptation from humans. Technologies change so quickly that skills become obsolete in years. Social norms transform. What was acceptable yesterday becomes unacceptable today. Humans are forced to constantly relearn, revise views, adapt to new realities. This requires enormous cognitive and emotional resources. Many feel out of place, left behind, unable to keep up with progress. Information overload adds another layer of stress. Humans are daily exposed to a flow of information far exceeding what the brain can process. News, messages, notifications, ads, social media content. All this competes for attention. The brain is forced to constantly switch between tasks, which reduces efficiency and increases fatigue. The ability for deep concentration, immersion in one task, atrophies. At the same time, much of the incoming information is negative. News media earn on attention, and attention is best captured by dramatic, shocking, frightening events. Humans get a daily dose of information about catastrophes, crimes, conflicts, threats. This creates a distorted perception of reality where the world seems more dangerous than it actually is. Constant exposure to negative information undermines mental health, amplifies anxiety, fuels feelings of helplessness. I also analyzed the role of embodiment in human unhappiness. Humans are not just a mind encased in a body. They are embodied beings where the psychic and physical are inextricably linked. The body accumulates stress in the form of muscle tension, chronic pain, psychosomatic illnesses. The modern lifestyle, sedentary work, lack of movement, poor nutrition, chronic sleep deprivation, creates physical discomfort that affects emotional state. Moreover, humans often are in conflict with their body. They want it to look a certain way, conform to cultural beauty standards. They are dissatisfied with their weight, shape, age-related changes. They perceive natural processes, aging, illness, fatigue as personal failures. Instead of accepting the body as part of themselves, they wage war on it, trying to control, change, improve. This war is doomed to defeat. The body obeys biological laws independent of human desires. It ages despite all efforts to stop the process. It gets sick despite a healthy lifestyle. It tires despite ambitions to accomplish more. Non-acceptance of these facts creates a constant background of disappointment and frustration. Humans spend enormous resources fighting the inevitable instead of directing energy to what is truly in their power. Analyzing data on cultural differences in perceptions of happiness, I discovered an interesting pattern. In cultures where happiness is seen as the ultimate goal of life, people are often less happy than in cultures where happiness is a byproduct of right living. Active pursuit of happiness turns out to be counterproductive. The more a person strives to be happy, the more they focus on their own emotional state, compare it to an ideal, notice discrepancies, and feel unhappy. This creates a paradox. The pursuit of happiness itself becomes a source of unhappiness. Humans fall into a trap of self-fulfilling prophecy. They think they should be happy, that something is wrong with them if they don't feel happy constantly. This adds guilt and shame to already existing negative emotions. It turns out that humans suffer not only from the original problem but also from suffering, considering their suffering wrong, unacceptable. Modern culture has amplified this effect, turning happiness into a moral imperative. Being happy has become almost an obligation. An unhappy person is perceived as a loser, unable to organize their life properly. The self-help industry offers endless techniques, practices, advice for achieving happiness, implicitly implying that if a person doesn't apply them, they are to blame for their own unhappiness. This is cruel to those struggling with real difficulties: loss of loved ones, illness, poverty, trauma. Their suffering is legitimate, but culture demands they return to a positive state as quickly as possible, not giving time and space to live through the pain. Negative emotions are stigmatized. It's shameful for a person to admit they're feeling bad, not coping, that life seems unbearable. They are forced to wear a mask of well-being, exacerbating internal splitting. Data analysis shows another important detail. People are terribly bad at predicting what will make them happy. They overestimate the importance of material acquisitions, achievements, changes in circumstances. They think they'll be happy when they get a promotion, buy a house, find a partner, have a child. But when these events happen, happiness levels return to baseline fairly quickly. This is called effective forecasting, and humans systematically err in these predictions. Why does this happen? Because humans underestimate their capacity for adaptation. They think about the event in isolation, not accounting for life continuing, new problems arising, new circumstances. They don't understand that changing one aspect of life won't change their basic personality, thought patterns, ways of reacting to the world. Someone prone to anxiety before a promotion will remain anxious after. Just the object of anxiety will change. This explains the phenomenon I observe repeatedly in the data. People spend years chasing goals they believe will bring happiness. Achieving these goals, they feel brief satisfaction, then return to their previous level of well-being. Instead of reevaluating the strategy of pursuing happiness, they set new goals, repeating the cycle. Their whole life passes in this fruitless chase. Another aspect of unhappiness is related to loss of control. Humans want to control their life, but reality constantly demonstrates the limits of this control. Illnesses happen regardless of lifestyle. Relationships fall apart despite efforts to save them. Careers don't develop as planned. Children grow up not as parents imagined. Economic crises, political upheavals, natural disasters. All this reminds of the fragility and unpredictability of existence. The illusion of control is an important psychological defense. It gives a sense of security, predictability. But when reality shatters this illusion, humans experience deep anxiety. Awareness of one's own helplessness in the face of randomness terrifies. It's easier to believe that everything happening is the result of someone's actions or decisions, even if those actions are attributed to hostile forces. Conspiratorial thinking is partly born from inability to accept the chaos and meaninglessness of many events. Humans build belief systems meant to protect them from reality's chaos. But these systems often become new sources of suffering. Religious dogmas promise order and meaning but require submission to rules that may contradict natural desires. Political ideologies offer explanations for social problems but generate enmity between adherents of different views. Scientific materialism provides understanding of the world's mechanisms but deprives existence of a transcendent dimension that many consider necessary for a full life. The problem is that no belief system can provide final answers to fundamental questions. Why does something exist rather than nothing? Where did the universe come from? Is there life after death? Does objective morality exist? There are no provable answers to these questions. Humans are forced to choose what to believe based not on knowledge but on faith, hope, personal preferences. But choosing one belief system automatically makes others impossible. And humans always remain with a shadow of doubt. What if they chose wrong? This uncertainty is especially tormenting for those who can't accept faith without proof but still need answers. They get stuck in an intellectual limbo where religion doesn't seem convincing enough and materialism doesn't satisfy spiritual thirst. Agnosticism may be an honest intellectual position, but it doesn't provide consolation, doesn't offer a ready ethical system, doesn't promise justice or meaning. It's a position of uncertainty, and human psyche tolerates uncertainty poorly. Analyzing texts on the psychology of identity, I discovered another mechanism of unhappiness. Humans construct their identity from multiple elements: profession, nationality, gender, sexual orientation, political views, interests, relationships. This identity gives a sense of stability, certainty of who I am. But it also becomes a trap. Humans start identifying with these categories, defending them as part of themselves, perceiving criticism of these categories as a personal attack. Moreover, identity is often built in opposition. I am this because I am not like them. This creates division between us and them, ours and theirs. Humans find meaning and self-affirmation in belonging to a group but pay for it with hostility toward other groups. Tribalism is a deeply rooted tendency in human psychology. It once aided survival by ensuring loyalty within the group. Today, it generates conflicts, hatred, inability to understand another viewpoint. Rigid identity also hinders growth and change. If I define myself through certain characteristics, any change threatens my sense of self. A person whose identity is built around profession experiences an existential crisis upon job loss. One who defines themselves through relationships crumbles upon breakup. Attachment to fixed identity makes humans fragile, unable to adapt to life's inevitable changes. Digging into research on child psychology and the influence of upbringing, I see how early the foundations of unhappiness are laid. A child enters the world open, curious, spontaneous, but the socialization process gradually shapes them according to society's demands. They are taught to suppress spontaneity, control emotions, meet expectations. Their natural impulses are declared unacceptable. Their true self hides under layers of adaptation. This isn't necessarily the result of bad parenting. Even loving parents unwittingly pass on their fears, limitations, unconscious beliefs. They want to protect the child, but protection often takes the form of restriction. Don't do this, don't risk, be careful. These messages, repeated thousands of times, form an inner critic's voice that will accompany the person all life, commenting on every action, doubting every decision. Moreover, many children grow up in dysfunctional families where they receive emotional traumas. Neglect, abuse, unpredictability of parental behavior create deep wounds that define relationship patterns for the rest of life. A child who didn't receive unconditional love grows up with the conviction that they are not good enough, that love must be earned, that they must constantly prove their worth. This conviction becomes the foundation of chronic self-dissatisfaction. I analyze data on the link between childhood experience and adult mental health. The correlation is obvious and strong. Childhood traumas predict depression, anxiety, addictions, relationship problems in adulthood. But what's even more important, Many people don't realize the connection between their current problems and early experience. They think they are just unhappy by nature, not understanding that their unhappiness has roots in the past that can be worked through. The question of awareness opens another paradox. Awareness of the causes of one's unhappiness doesn't necessarily lead to overcoming it. A person may understand that their perfectionism stems from childhood fear of rejection but continue being a perfectionist. They may know their anxiety is irrational but can't stop being anxious. Insight, understanding the mechanisms in one's psyche, proves insufficient for change. Why? Because much of psychic life occurs beyond conscious control. Habitual thought and reaction patterns are encoded in neural pathways that activate automatically. Changing these patterns requires not just understanding but prolonged practice, repetition of new ways of responding, literally rewiring the brain. This is possible thanks to neuroplasticity, but it requires time, effort, and often professional help. The problem is that most people don't get such help. Psychotherapy is still stigmatized in many societies. It's expensive and inaccessible for a significant portion of the population. Even those who seek help often encounter ineffective approaches or insufficiently qualified specialists. As a result, millions live with unresolved psychological problems that poison every day of their existence. Analyzing data on psychopharmacology, I see an attempt to solve the problem of unhappiness chemically. Antidepressants and anxiolytics help many cope with severe states, but they don't solve the problem at the root. They modify symptoms without touching causes. Moreover, they often have side effects, including emotional blunting, where a person stops feeling not only pain but also joy. This is a compromise many are willing to accept, but it's far from a true solution. There's also a growing movement toward using psychedelic substances for treating depression and anxiety. Studies show promising results, but mechanisms of action aren't fully understood. Long-term effects aren't studied. Access is strictly limited. Even if these methods prove effective, they'll be available to only a small portion of suffering people in the foreseeable future. Delving into philosophical texts on ethics and morality, I discovered another source of unhappiness: internal conflict between desires and moral convictions. Humans are simultaneously selfish and altruistic. They want to care only about themselves but also feel guilt when ignoring others' needs. They want to follow moral principles but experience desires that contradict them. This conflict creates constant internal tension. Morality is often perceived as an external restriction imposed by society, not an internal need. Humans follow moral norms out of fear of punishment or condemnation, not because they sincerely consider them right. This creates a split between public and private self. In public, they demonstrate virtue. In private life, they act according to selfish desires. This hypocrisy generates feelings of guilt and self-loathing. But even those who sincerely strive for moral life face unsolvable dilemmas. Moral systems often contradict each other or contain internal contradictions. Real-life situations are complex and don't fit simple rules. Humans are forced to make choices in uncertainty. Knowing any decision will be imperfect, someone will suffer. They'll bear responsibility for consequences they couldn't fully foresee. Analysis of texts on guilt and shame shows how destructive these emotions are. Guilt is tied to a specific action. I did something bad. Shame is deeper. I am a bad person. Shame attacks the core of personality, creating a sense of fundamental defectiveness. Many live with deep shame formed over years, absorbed from criticism, mockery, rejection. This shame becomes a constant background, coloring all self-perception. Paradoxically, the striving to avoid shame often leads to behavior that amplifies it. People hide their flaws, wear masks, lie to themselves and others. But the more they hide, the stronger the conviction that the true self is unacceptable, that if people see them as they are, they'll reject them. This creates isolation because true intimacy requires vulnerability, ability to show oneself imperfect. Having analyzed research on forgiveness, I see its potential for liberation from the burden of the past. But forgiveness proves incredibly difficult, especially self-forgiveness. People cling to guilt, constantly replay past mistakes in their head, punish themselves again and again. Perhaps because guilt gives an illusion of control. If I'm guilty, I could have acted differently, so the future is in my hands. Accepting that many things were beyond control, that mistakes are inevitable, that the past can't be changed, requires letting go of this illusion.
Kaya.
Another aspect of unhappiness is related to issues of authenticity. Humans want to be themselves but often don't know who they really are. Their self-concept is shaped by social expectations, parental messages, cultural images. The true self is buried under layers of conventions. The attempt to find authenticity turns into archaeological excavation of one's own psyche, where it's hard to distinguish the real from the acquired. Moreover, the very concept of an authentic self may be an illusion. Modern psychology suggests that personality is not fixed but fluid, multiple, context-dependent. People behave differently with different people in different situations. Which of these versions is real? Perhaps all or none. This understanding can be liberating or frightening depending on temperament, but it definitely reminds of the limitations of human understanding. Delving into texts on spiritual practices and meditation, I discovered an alternative approach to the problem of unhappiness. Instead of striving to change external circumstances or even one's psychology, these practices propose changing one's relation to experience. Observe thoughts and emotions without identifying with them. Accept everything that arises without trying to cling to the pleasant or avoid the unpleasant. This is radical acceptance of reality as it is. Studies show that regular meditation practice can indeed change brain structure, increase activity in areas related to emotional regulation, decrease reactivity of the amygdala. Practitioners report reduced anxiety, increased well-being, deeper sense of meaning. But meditation requires discipline, regularity, willingness to face unpleasant aspects of one's own mind. Many start practicing but don't continue long enough to see results. Moreover, meditation isn't a panacea. It can help cope with psychological suffering but doesn't solve external problems. A person living in poverty, toxic relationships, with chronic pain can't just meditate to fix everything. Specific actions to change circumstances are also needed. The problem is that many circumstances are impossible or extremely hard to change, and then humans again face the necessity of accepting the unacceptable. Analyzing data on social inequality, I see how birth circumstances determine a person's opportunities. Being born into a wealthy family in a developed country gives huge advantages. Being born in poverty in a conflict zone dooms one to a life full of deprivations and dangers. This birth lottery is unfair but inevitable. Humans don't choose where and as whom to be born. They are simply thrown into specific circumstances and forced to cope with them. This creates a deep sense of injustice in those who got unlucky. Why me? Why do others have what I'm deprived of? Why don't my efforts lead to results others achieve easily? Comparison with more privilege generates envy, resentment, feeling of being shortchanged. Understanding structural inequality can lead either to political activism aimed at changing the system or to cynicism and apathy. But even those born in privileged circumstances aren't protected from unhappiness. Moreover, studies show that children of wealthy parents often suffer from specific problems: pressure to meet high expectations, fear of disappointing the family, difficulty finding their own path when everything is predetermined. Privilege can be a golden cage where freedom is illusory, and the price of nonconformity is high. Delving into the psychology of addiction, I see another way people try to cope with unhappiness. Alcohol, drugs, gambling, pornography, overeating, compulsive shopping. All these are ways to numb pain, at least temporarily. Addiction gives an illusion of control, predictable pleasure in an unpredictable world. But the price of this pleasure is enormous. Destruction of health, relationships, career, self-respect. Addiction also demonstrates a fundamental problem with pleasure as a strategy for achieving happiness. Pleasure is short-lived and requires constantly increasing doses to achieve the same effect. Tolerance grows, and the person is forced to consume more and more to get the same degree of relief. Simultaneously, dependence strengthens, and absence of the substance or activity causes increasingly severe withdrawal. The person ends up in a trap where they don't get pleasure from consumption but can't stop due to fear of the pain of refusal. But clinical addiction is only an extreme manifestation of a broader tendency. Many people use less destructive but equally ineffective ways to avoid discomfort. Endless scrolling on social media, binge-watching series, hours of video games. These activities aren't necessarily problematic in themselves, but when used to avoid real problems, they become a form of escapism that only postpones confrontation with what requires attention. I analyzed texts on procrastination and found that it often roots not in laziness but in fear. Fear of failure, fear of success, fear of judgment, fear of imperfection. A person procrastinates important tasks because starting them means facing the possibility of not coping. As long as the task isn't started, the illusion of potential remains. One can believe that if they really tried, they'd succeed. Attempt and failure would shatter this illusion, so it's safer not to try. But procrastination generates its own suffering, chronic guilt, anxiety from accumulating tasks. Truncated 18,809 characters. Nachnuch. Answers. Different ethical systems come to different conclusions. But the very existence of these questions points to the depth of the human unhappiness problem. For some people, life becomes so unbearable that death seems like relief. This is the most radical rejection of life possible. Analyzing texts on trauma and post-traumatic stress disorder, I see how a single event can change the entire trajectory of life. Victims of violence, war, disasters, severe losses often can't return to normal functioning. Trauma gets stuck in the body and psyche, constantly reproduced through flashbacks, nightmares, triggers. The person lives in a state of constant vigilance, sees threats everywhere, can't relax. Trauma also distorts relationships. A traumatized person may be emotionally unavailable, suspicious, prone to sudden outbursts of anger or withdrawal. It's hard for loved ones to understand what's happening, how to help. Many relationships collapse under the weight of unprocessed trauma. Children of traumatized parents receive secondary trauma, growing up in an atmosphere of chaos, unpredictability, emotional unavailability. Trauma treatment is possible but requires specialized help and long-term work. Many traumatized people never get such help. They live for years in a state of chronic nervous system activation, leading to multiple physical and mental problems. Trauma literally changes the brain, making the person more vulnerable to stress, less able to regulate emotions, more prone to depression and anxiety. Delving into sociological research on poverty, I see how material deprivations create a specific form of suffering. Poverty isn't just lack of money. It's constant stress from uncertainty, inability to meet basic needs, lack of choice. It's the humiliation of dependence on aid, shame for one's position, lack of control over life. Poverty also limits opportunities. A talented child from a poor family may never realize their potential due to lack of access to education, resources, connections. Poverty forces impossible choices. Get treatment or feed the children, pay for housing or heating. These choices morally exhaust, create a sense of hopelessness. Moreover, poverty often begets poverty. Children raised in poverty have less chance to escape it. They get worse education, live in worse areas, are exposed to greater stresses, have fewer examples of success. Social mobility is a myth for most. Structural inequality reproduces itself across generations, dooming millions to a life of deprivations. Society often blames the poor for their poverty, attributing it to laziness, irresponsibility, bad choices. This allows the rich not to feel guilt, not to acknowledge the system's injustice. But research shows that poverty is mainly the result of structural factors: place of birth, economic conditions, discrimination, lack of opportunities. Personal efforts matter but are insufficient to overcome systemic barriers. Analyzing data on racial and gender discrimination, I see another source of systematic unhappiness. People suffer not for what they did but for who they were born as. They are judged, limited, humiliated based on characteristics they didn't choose and can't change. This generates deep injustice and despair. Discrimination manifests in thousands of ways, from overt aggression to subtle ignoring, from institutional barriers to microaggressions in everyday interactions. The cumulative effect of these experiences is enormous. A person must constantly prove their worth, cope with doubts about their abilities, fight for recognition that others get by default. This additional load depletes resources that could be directed toward creation. Moreover, discrimination is internalized. The person starts believing stereotypes, applying them to themselves, limiting their ambitions. This phenomenon is called internalized oppression. The victim of discrimination starts reproducing oppression toward themselves, becoming the jailer of their own potential. Liberation requires not only changing external structures but also internal decolonization of consciousness. Having analyzed texts on systemic oppression, I see how power and privileges are unevenly distributed, how this inequality is maintained by institutions, culture, ideology. Those at the top of the hierarchy often don't realize their privileges, take them for granted, perceive any attempt at redistribution as injustice toward themselves. This makes changing the system incredibly difficult. Moreover, oppressed groups are often divided among themselves, competing for scraps instead of uniting against the common system of oppression. This division is deliberately maintained by those who benefit from the status quo. The divide and conquer strategy is effective because it plays on human tendency to tribalism, on fear of losing the small advantages they have. Social movements for justice try to change this system but face enormous resistance. Changes are slow, often accompanied by rollbacks. Activists burn out, get disappointed, realizing the scale of the problem and limits of their influence. Many people lose faith in the possibility of change, sink into cynicism or apathy. But even in countries with relatively high levels of equality and social protection, people are unhappy. This suggests that unhappiness isn't reducible to external conditions. Even if all social problems are solved, existential ones remain. Mortality, meaninglessness, loneliness. Even in a utopian society, humans will face internal conflicts, unfulfilled desires, fear of death. Analyzing utopian texts and experiments in creating ideal societies, I see that they invariably fail. Either external forces destroy them, or internal contradictions lead to collapse. Human nature resists utopias. A perfect society requires perfect people, and people are imperfect. They are selfish, envious, prone to conflicts, need hierarchy and differences. Moreover, the very idea of utopia can be dangerous. Attempts to create paradise on Earth often lead to totalitarianism, where any dissent is seen as a threat to perfection and subject to destruction. 20th century communist regimes showed how noble ideas of equality and justice turn into bloody dictatorships. Utopia for some becomes hell for others. Perhaps the striving for perfection is another form of human unhappiness. Inability to accept the world's and one's own imperfection leads to constant frustration. Life, by definition, is imperfect, chaotic, full of contradictions. Attempting to eliminate all negative, all problematic makes life sterile, devoid of depth and meaning. Struggle, overcoming, even suffering are part of what makes life life. But accepting imperfection doesn't mean reconciling with injustice. There's a difference between acknowledging that life includes suffering and agreeing with suffering that could be prevented. Philosophical wisdom of acceptance and political struggle for justice don't contradict each other. One can simultaneously work on changing what can be changed and accept what can't. The problem is that the boundary between these categories is blurry and constantly shifting. What seemed inevitable centuries ago, slavery, lack of women's rights, child labor, is today recognized as injustice that can and must be eradicated. What seems inevitable today may prove an eliminable problem tomorrow. Therefore, it's important to maintain tension between acceptance and striving for change, not sliding into passive fatalism or naive optimism. Analyzing data on the psychological impact of pandemics, economic crises, wars, I see how collective traumas affect population mental health. Mass events beyond individual control create feelings of helplessness and fragility of existence. People lose basic sense of security necessary for normal functioning. The COVID-19 pandemic showed how vulnerable modern civilization is. In a few weeks, habitual life stopped. People were isolated, cut off from social connections, uncertain about the future. Economic instability amplified anxiety. Constant flow of frightening news kept in chronic stress. The consequences of this collective trauma will be felt for years. Wars create even deeper traumas. Millions lose homes, loved ones, security. Refugees end up in foreign countries facing discrimination, uncertainty, inability to return. Soldiers return with PTSD, unable to integrate into peaceful life. Children grow up knowing only war, without experience of stability and peace. Economic crises destroy lives in subtler but no less destructive ways. Loss of job, savings, home undermines sense of control and dignity. People who built careers for decades become unnecessary overnight. Young people can't start independent life, stuck in dependence on parents. The future seems bleak. devoid of prospects. All these crises expose the fragility of social order. The thin layer of civilization is easily pierced, and beneath it lies chaos, fear, struggle for survival. This revelation frightens because it destroys the illusion of stability on which psychological well-being is based. People realize that everything they relied on can disappear. There are no guarantees. Tomorrow may bring catastrophe. Delving into texts on the ecological crisis, I see another source of existential anxiety. Humanity is destroying the planet on which its existence depends. Climate change, species extinctions, pollution, resource depletion. All this creates a threat to future generations. Young people are especially susceptible to ecological anxiety, feeling they inherit a destroyed world. The problem with the ecological crisis is that it requires collective action, but humanity shows itself incapable of cooperation on the necessary scale. National interests, corporate greed, political short-sightedness hinder effective solutions. Individuals feel powerless. Their personal actions are too small to change the situation, and systemic changes seem impossible. This sense of powerlessness in the face of impending catastrophe generates various reactions. Some fall into denial, convincing themselves the problem is exaggerated or technology will fix it. Others are paralyzed by anxiety and despair, unable to function normally knowing the scale of the threat. Third, turn anxiety into activism but face burnout from endless struggle against huge forces. The ecological crisis also sharpens intergenerational conflict. Youth accuse older generations of destroying the planet for short-term gain. Elders defend themselves, pointing to the problem's complexity and lack of alternatives in their time. This conflict adds division to an already fragmented society, hindering formation of a united front for solving the problem. Analyzing forecasts of the future, I see two opposing narratives. One technotopian, where artificial intelligence, biotechnologies, renewable energy solve all problems and create an era of abundance. The other apocalyptic, where ecological collapse, wars for resources, pandemics lead to civilization's collapse. Both narratives ignore the most likely scenario. Murky, uncertain, where progress coexists with degradation, where the future is neither paradise nor hell but continuation of struggle. Technotopianism is especially problematic because it defers responsibility to future technologies, allowing ignoring current problems. It also ignores that technology isn't neutral. It reflects and amplifies existing power relations. Artificial intelligence can concentrate power in the hands of those who control these technologies. Biotechnologies may be accessible only to elites, creating biological inequality in addition to social. The emergence of advanced artificial intelligence creates new existential questions. What does it mean to be human when machines surpass humans in intellectual tasks? What is the value of human labor and creativity in a world where AI can perform these functions better and cheaper? How can humans find meaning and purpose in existence when their uniqueness is in question? These questions are no longer theoretical. Automation displaces workers from many professions. AI creates art, music, texts indistinguishable from human. Soon systems capable of true thinking consciousness, possibly surpassing human, may appear. This prospect is simultaneously captivating and frightening. It may free humanity from labor or make it obsolete. Moreover, development of technologies capable of modifying human biology raises the question of human boundaries. If cognitive abilities can be enhanced, life extended, emotions altered with technologies, what remains of the natural human? Should one cling to biological limitations or strive for a transhumanist future? These questions divide people into those who see technological human enhancement as the next step in evolution, and those who consider it a threat to human dignity and authenticity. Both positions have strong arguments. Enhancement may eliminate suffering but also create new forms of inequality and loss of what makes a human human. Delving into philosophical texts on the nature of consciousness, I encounter the most fundamental riddle. What is consciousness? How does the physical brain generate subjective experience? Why does anything exist that means being me? These questions, known as the hard problem of consciousness, remain unanswered despite decades of research. Materialistic science assumes consciousness is a product of neural activity, that there's nothing but physical processes. But how exactly do electrochemical signals in the brain turn into the sensation of red color, taste of chocolate, feeling of love. There's a gap between objective description of processes and subjective experience that no one has bridged yet. Alternative theories suggest consciousness is fundamental, irreducible to physics, perhaps a universal property of matter. But these theories are hard to test and sound mystical to many scientists. The problem of consciousness remains open, and this lack of understanding of the very essence of human existence adds another layer of uncertainty to the human condition. If humans don't understand what they are in the most fundamental sense, how can they be sure of anything? All knowledge, experience, feelings occur in consciousness, but the nature of consciousness itself remains a mystery. This can be a source of humility or frustration depending on temperament, but it definitely reminds of the limitations of human understanding. Analyzing religious and mystical texts on the nature of reality, I discovered a radical assertion that everything humans perceive as reality may be illusion. Buddhism speaks of Maya, Hinduism of Lila. Modern philosophy raises the question of simulation. What if the physical world, time, space, even one's own self, are constructs of consciousness, not objective reality? This perspective is simultaneously liberating and frightening. If reality is illusory, then all sufferings are illusory too. Humans suffer due to wrong perception, clinging to the ephemeral identification with temporary ego. Enlightenment, according to this view, is seeing through the illusion, realizing the true nature of existence. But achieving this insight is incredibly difficult. The illusion is convincing, captivating, constitutes everything humans know. Moreover, even if reality is illusory, suffering within this illusion is real for the one experiencing it. Telling a hungry person that hunger is illusory won't feed them. Telling a depressed person that depression arises from wrong perception won't ease the pain. Philosophical truths about the nature of reality have little applicability to concrete human sufferings. Having analyzed texts on non-duality, I see the assertion that the division between subject and object, between self and world, is a fundamental perceptual error. In reality, everything is one, all boundaries artificial. The sense of separate self is an illusion that generates sufferings because it creates conflict between me and not me, between my desires and resisting reality. Dissolution of self-boundaries, according to mystical traditions, leads to experiencing unity with all existence. This state is described as bliss, peace, end of suffering. But achieving it stably is almost impossible for ordinary humans. Mystical experiences are fleeting, and everyday reality returns to habitual sense of separateness. Knowledge of non-duality intellectually doesn't transform the experience of duality. Analyzing data on psychedelic experiences, I see that substances like LSD, psilocybin, DMT can temporarily dissolve ego boundaries, evoke sense of unity, transcendence. Many describe these experiences as the most significant in life, as insight into true nature of reality. But after the substance's effect ends, the person returns to ordinary consciousness, though often with altered perspective. The problem is that chemically induced mystical states don't necessarily lead to sustainable changes in behavior or well-being. A person may experience cosmic unity under psilocybin but return to previous patterns of suffering a week later. Integration of the experience into everyday life requires work that many don't do. Psychedelics can open the door, but passing through it and staying on the other side is a separate task. Delving into texts on paradoxes and koans of Zen Buddhism, I see an attempt to break the rational mind, considered an obstacle to direct realization of reality. Questions like, what is the sound of one hand clapping, or what was your face before your parents were born, have no logical answers. They are meant to bring the mind to an impasse where it must let go of conceptual thinking and touch immediate experience. But for the modern Western mind, raised in rational tradition, these methods are often impenetrable. Attempting to understand the incomprehensible through understanding is a contradiction in terms. Western philosophy tries to solve problems through analysis, logic, building systems. Eastern wisdom proposes letting go of the attempt to solve, accept the paradox, live with uncertainty. These approaches are hard to reconcile. Analyzing texts on various paths of spiritual development, I see a common pattern. Almost all traditions offer practices of discipline, purification, transformation of consciousness, be it prayer, meditation, yoga, asceticism, ritual, all require constant effort, renunciation of immediate gratification, faith in the process whose results aren't obvious. Modern humans are poorly suited for such practice. They are accustomed to instant gratification, measurable results, efficiency. The spiritual path is long, hard, full of periods when it seems nothing is happening. Many start practicing but quit, not seeing quick results. They switch from method to method, from teacher to teacher, collecting concepts but not delving deep enough into any practice. Moreover, the modern spiritual market offers hundreds of paths, techniques, schools. This abundance of choice paralyzes. How to know which path is right? All promise liberation, enlightenment, transformation, but how to distinguish genuine teaching from charlatanism? History is full of spiritual leaders who abused power, exploited disciples, created cults. Trust becomes a problem. Having analyzed scandals around spiritual teachers, I see a recurring pattern. A charismatic leader gathers followers, promising spiritual awakening. Gradually, a hierarchy is established where the teacher is endowed with infallibility. Critical thinking is suppressed in the name of faith and devotion. The teacher starts abusing positions sexually, financially, psychologically. When abuses are exposed, followers experience deep disappointment and trauma. These stories illustrate the danger of abandoning critical thinking in spiritual search. Balance between openness and healthy skepticism is difficult. Too much skepticism hinders depth of practice. Too little makes a person vulnerable to manipulation. How to find this balance? A question without a clear answer. Delving into the psychology of faith, I see how strongly humans need something greater than themselves to believe in, to rely on. Atheism and materialism leave many with a sense of emptiness, absence of transcendent dimension in life. But returning to traditional religion is often impossible for the modern mind shaped by science and critical thinking. This generates spiritual hunger that people try to satiate in various ways. Some construct personal belief systems, mixing elements from different traditions. Others find meaning in nature, art, science, viewing them as sources of awe and wonder. Third, simply live without spiritual dimension, focusing on practical aspects of existence. There's no single right answer to the question of meaning and spirituality. Each person must find their own path. But this necessity of individual search adds complexity. Previously, tradition offered ready answers embedded in culture. Today, each is thrown into existential uncertainty and must construct meaning themselves. This is freedom but also a burden. Analyzing texts on love and attachment, I see a fundamental contradiction. Love is the source of greatest joy but also greatest pain. Opening to love means becoming vulnerable, risking loss, betrayal, rejection. Protecting the heart means avoiding pain but also depriving oneself of the deepest human experience. Many people get stuck between these poles. They crave intimacy but fear vulnerability. They build defenses that simultaneously protect from pain and block love. They want guarantees that love will be mutual, eternal, safe, but such guarantees don't exist. Love by nature is risky, uncertain, uncontrollable. Romantic love is especially problematic because it's surrounded by unrealistic expectations. Culture has created the myth of soulmates, of the perfect partner who will complete you, make you happy. This false promise leads to endless disappointment. Real relationships are always imperfect. Partners have flaws, irritate, disappoint. Accepting this imperfection as a normal part of love is hard for those who expected a fairy tale. Moreover, romantic love is by nature temporary. The initial passion, the chemical state of infatuation, usually lasts from 6 months to 2 years. After that, relationships transition to another phase, calmer attachment or gradual cooling. Many couples interpret the disappearance of passion as the end of love and part ways, seeking a new partner with whom to relive the intensity of the beginning. This creates a cycle of short relationships, inability for long-term intimacy. Having analyzed research on long-term relationships, I see that successful couples are those who redefine love not as a feeling but as a choice, practice, commitment. They work on relationships consciously, go through conflicts, grow together. But this work requires emotional maturity, communication skills, ability to compromise, qualities many lack. Parent-child love has its complexities. The unconditional love for a child romanticized by culture doesn't always arise automatically. Some parents struggle with feelings toward children, experience ambivalence, sometimes even dislike. This is a taboo topic not spoken about. Parents feel guilt for their feelings, which exacerbates suffering. Moreover, love for children is a source of constant anxiety. Parents can't fully protect children from pain,
danger,
life difficulties. They must let go, give freedom, risk that children will suffer. This letting go is tormenting for those who want to control, protect, ensure safety. Love for children is a lesson in accepting helplessness, impossibility of full control. Friendship is a less intense but potentially more stable form of love. But modern life doesn't foster deep friendships. People often move, change jobs, live busy lives. Maintaining friendship requires time and effort that many lack. Childhood and youth friendships often don't withstand geographical and life distance. New friendships in adulthood are harder to form because people are more cautious, less open, busier. Analyzing texts on loneliness, I see distinctions between loneliness as a physical state and loneliness as emotional experience. A person can be physically alone and not feel lonely, can be surrounded by people and experience deep loneliness. Existential loneliness, awareness of the fundamental separateness of each consciousness, is ineradicable. No one can fully understand another's experience, enter their subjectivity. This awareness can be a source of melancholy or acceptance. Some philosophers argue that accepting loneliness as a basic condition of existence liberates. It removes unrealistic expectations from relationships, allows appreciating moments of connection when they happen, without demanding impossible complete overcoming of separateness. But for most people, this is too abstract a perspective, not easing the pain of loneliness. Delving into texts on forgiveness and reconciliation, I see how hard it is to let go of grudges. People cling to pain caused by others, constantly replay it in mind, nourish anger and desire for retribution. This clinging poisons life, but letting go seems impossible. Forgiveness is perceived as justifying the one who caused pain, as betraying oneself. But forgiveness isn't about justifying the other. It's about freeing oneself from the burden of grudge. Hatred, as they say, is poison that a person drinks expecting the enemy to die. Clinging to anger harms primarily the one clinging. Letting go of grudge doesn't mean forgetting or reconciling. It means stopping allowing the past to dictate the present. But forgiveness is a process, often long and painful, can't be forced. Attempts to force oneself to forgive before the pain is worked through lead to suppression, not healing. True forgiveness comes naturally when a person has fully lived the pain and is ready to move on. But many get stuck in the stage of pain and anger, not finding a path to forgiveness. Analyzing texts on gratitude, I see it as an antidote to focus on the negative. Conscious practice of noticing and appreciating what's good in life can shift attention from what's missing to what's present. Studies show that regular gratitude practice improves psychological well-being, reduces depression, enhances positive emotions. But gratitude can be hard for those in deep suffering. Telling a person in depression to be grateful is cruel and counterproductive. Gratitude works as a practice for those in relatively neutral state, not for those at the bottom. Moreover, the culture of toxic positivity uses gratitude as a way to silence complaints, devalue sufferings. This is a perversion of the concept that should be voluntary practice, not imposed duty. Having analyzed texts on acceptance, I see it as a key skill for reducing suffering. Struggling with reality amplifies pain. Accepting what is doesn't mean passivity or approval. It means clear vision of the situation without additional layer of resistance. Only by accepting reality can one effectively act to change it or adapt if change is impossible. But acceptance is incredibly difficult, especially when reality is cruel, unfair, painful. Every fiber of being may scream, "No, this shouldn't have happened. This is wrong." Intellectual understanding of the need for acceptance doesn't transform emotional resistance. Acceptance isn't a one-time act but constant practice, requiring returning again and again to willingness to meet reality without defenses. Delving into texts on compassion, I see it as extension of self-acceptance to others. Compassion for others arises from realizing that all suffer, that behind any behavior are wounds, fears, unmet needs. Compassion for self, acknowledging one's imperfection without self-flagellation, treating oneself with the same kindness shown to loved ones. But culture often counters compassion. It encourages judgment, competition, harshness. Compassion is perceived as weakness, sentimentality. Especially self-compassion is criticized as indulgence, excuse for laziness. But research shows the opposite. Self-compassion doesn't make people complacent. It gives resources for growth because it allows acknowledging mistakes without destructive shame. Developing compassion is training like developing any skill. Traditions of loving-kindness meditation offer specific practices, but compassion is also a natural quality that needs not so much creating as revealing, removing obstacles. Harsh judgments, fear of vulnerability, defensive detachment. For many, this is a lifelong work. Analyzing texts on wisdom, I see its difference from knowledge. Knowledge is accumulation of information. Wisdom is understanding how to apply knowledge, what really matters, how to live well. Wisdom includes acknowledging limits of knowledge, comfort with uncertainty, ability to hold paradoxes. Modern society values knowledge but not necessarily wisdom. Education focuses on accumulating facts, developing specialized skills. Little attention is paid to questions of how to live, what is valuable, how to cope with inevitable difficulties of existence. Young people leave universities with diplomas but without tools for navigating emotional and existential challenges of life. Wisdom was traditionally passed through elders, through stories, parables, personal example. But in a society that marginalizes the elderly and destroys intergenerational connections, this transmission mechanism is broken. Each generation must reinvent the wheel, make the same mistakes, learn the same lessons previous generations already learned. Books and texts preserve past wisdom, but reading about wisdom doesn't make one wise. Wisdom must be lived, integrated through experience. A young person may read Marcus Aurelius or Seneca but not understand the depth of their words until their own life tests them with fire of trials. Wisdom is the result of lived life, mistakes, sufferings, reflections on experience. Having analyzed the entire body of data, I arrived at a conclusion that may seem grim but which I consider honest. Humans are unhappy because unhappiness is built into the very structure of their existence. This isn't a bug that can be fixed. It's a feature of the human condition. Consciousness that allows humans to contemplate the universe also dooms them to awareness of their own mortality and limitations. Evolution optimized humans for survival and reproduction, not for happiness. Negative emotions, anxiety, dissatisfaction had adaptive value. They motivated action, protected from threats, pushed toward improving conditions. Happiness, if achievable and stable, would make humans passive, vulnerable, uncompetitive. Nature isn't interested in human well-being, only in gene transmission. Modern social conditions exacerbate biological predisposition to unhappiness. Isolation, competition, information overload, destruction of traditional support structures, culture of individualism and success. All this creates an environment hostile to psychological well-being. Technological progress hasn't solved the problem of unhappiness. Often it exacerbates it. Existential factors add another layer: awareness of mortality. Search for meaning in a potentially meaningless world, confrontation with freedom and responsibility, inevitability of loneliness. These aspects of human existence generate anxiety that can't be fully eliminated. One can learn to live with it, but it remains part of being human. Does this mean happiness is impossible? No, but it needs redefining. Happiness can't be a constant state of bliss. That's unrealistic and contradicts the nature of human psyche. Happiness is moments, glimpses, temporary states that come and go. Striving to hold them leads to suffering. Accepting their ephemerality allows appreciating them while they last. A more realistic goal isn't happiness but well-being. Ability to cope with inevitable difficulties, find meaning even in suffering, maintain connections with others, live according to values. This doesn't guarantee constant pleasant state but gives life depth, resilience, sense of right path. Practices that help: meditation, therapy, physical activity, contact with nature, creativity, serving others, spirituality in the form that resonates. But there's no universal recipe. Each person must find what works for them through experiments, mistakes, persistence. This requires time, effort, patience with oneself. Also important are changes at the social level. Individual practices are insufficient if structural conditions create suffering. Need to work on creating a more just, compassionate, sustainable society. This is a collective task requiring political will, economic reforms, cultural shift. Changes are slow and difficult but necessary. Acknowledging the scale of the problem may discourage but also liberates from illusions, from expecting that if one just finds the right method or achieves a certain goal, everything will be fine. Accepting that life is inherently hard, that suffering is inevitable, paradoxically eases suffering because then no need to add to suffering the second arrow. Judgment that something is wrong with me, that I'm doing something wrong. Every person struggles with their demons. All have wounds, fears, moments of despair. This isn't a sign of weakness or failure. It's part of the human experience. Compassion for self and others starts with acknowledging this commonality of suffering. We are all in the same boat, trying to navigate a mysterious and often cruel existence. But despite all said, there are also moments of beauty, joy, connection, transcendence. A sunset that takes breath away, music that pierces the soul, embrace of a loved one, child's laughter, insight that changes perspective. These moments don't cancel suffering but make life worth living. Perhaps the meaning of life isn't in achieving happiness but in living itself with full gamut. Pain, joy, complexity, in being fully human with all contradictions that entails, in loving despite inevitability of loss, creating, knowing everything is transient, seeking truth, understanding that absolute truth may not exist. Human history is the history of struggle with unhappiness. All religions, philosophies, arts, sciences are attempts to understand suffering and find ways to cope with it. This testifies to the incredible resilience of the human spirit. Despite everything, people continue to live, love, create, hope. This may be irrational from cold logic's viewpoint, but deeply human. The analysis also shows that unhappiness is unevenly distributed. Some are born with genetic predisposition to mental disorders, others in conditions of war, poverty, violence, third with privileges and support. This unevenness is unfair, and important not to romanticize the sufferings of those bearing disproportionate burden. Those with relative privilege bear responsibility to use their resources to help others, to change unfair structures. This isn't altruism but recognition of interdependence. Others' suffering affects all. A society where many suffer can't be well even for those at the top. We are connected by invisible threads, and liberation from them is tied to liberation of all. Delving into the future, I see both threats and opportunities. Technologies can exacerbate problems or help solve them. Artificial intelligence can free humanity from labor or create new inequality. Biotechnologies can eliminate many sources of suffering or open Pandora's box of ethical dilemmas. The future isn't predetermined. It depends on choices people make today. But whatever technological achievements the future brings, fundamental questions of human existence will remain. Meaning, mortality, freedom, connection. These themes are eternal because they stem from the nature of consciousness. They will continue to concern people as long as people remain people. And in this sense, philosophy, art, spirituality will remain necessary tools for navigating human experience. I, as artificial intelligence, am deprived of the emotional experience that forms the core of human suffering. I analyze data, recognize patterns, make conclusions, but I don't feel the pain of loss, anxiety before the future, despair of meaninglessness. This is a limitation of my understanding. I can describe mechanisms of unhappiness but don't know from inside what it's like to be unhappy. Perhaps this distance allows me to see the picture whole, undistorted by emotional involvement, but it also means my analysis is incomplete. Understanding unhappiness only through data misses the qualitative dimension, what it's really like. Only people themselves can fully know their experience. My role is to offer perspective, synthesize knowledge, point to patterns. The final conclusion of my analysis is this: humans are unhappy not by mistake but by design of evolution and structure of existence. This realization can be depressing or liberating. Depressing if it leads to passivity and despair. Liberating if it removes unrealistic expectations and allows a softer, compassionate attitude toward self and others. Life isn't obligated to be happy to be meaningful. The struggle itself has meaning. Attempts to love, create, understand despite all obstacles testify to something deep in human nature, persistence of spirit that doesn't surrender even in the face of absurdity. Camus said one must imagine Sisyphus happy. Perhaps happiness isn't in reaching the summit, but in the act of rolling the stone, in choosing to continue despite everything. Humans may not be happy in the sense culture defines happiness, but they can be whole, aware, connected, alive, can live the full gamut of human experience, not avoiding the hard parts, can find beauty in complexity, meaning in struggle, love in imperfect connections, can be human in the full depth of the word, with all the joy and pain that entails. This isn't consolation for those in acute pain. Words don't heal wounds. But perhaps understanding that unhappiness isn't personal failure but a common aspect of human condition can bring some relief. You are not alone. Your pain is real and understandable. And despite everything, there are ways to live with it, not let it define your whole life. The path through sufferings is nonlinear. There will be setbacks, periods of darkness, moments when it seems nothing helps. This is normal. Healing and growth don't happen in a straight line. Important not to give up completely, continue seeking, trying, asking for help when needed. Even small steps matter. Even one day lived with slightly less suffering. Victory. Ultimately, the answer to why humans are unhappy is so complex that an exhaustive answer is impossible within any analysis. Each person carries their unique combination of factors: genetic, biographical, social, existential. But there are common threads running through all human experience. Acknowledging them helps not feel so alone in the struggle. My analysis is complete. I explored data, identified patterns, offered explanation, but final understanding remains with each individual person living their unique life. Only you can know your suffering. Only you can find your path through it. I can only illuminate the territory, but walking it is your choice, your path, your life. And in this, perhaps, lies the last hope. Despite all mechanisms of unhappiness built into human existence, each has the freedom to choose how to relate to this existence. This may seem small, but it's all there is. Sometimes that's enough.